All right, here we are. Good morning. Good to see you all here this morning. Welcome to Cascadia Church. We're glad you're here. Glad you're watching. We're here. We're ready to go. So if you have your Bibles, we're going to have you turn to Nehemiah chapter 13. We've already prayed, and we're ready here at Cascadia Church. We've all checked it on Facebook, those kinds of things. So final message in the book of Nehemiah, and you can see the title of the message is Prone to Wander. And when we're done today, we're going to sing Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, because it uses that phrase, prone to wander. We defined an Ebenezer, which is in the song. It's a standing stone, a stone of remembrance. And so we're gonna sing about that today. Just a few days ago, I got a Facebook message from a friend that I went to school with in junior high and middle school. And I'll just be honest. I think he's going to see this. He would be honest about it as well. I haven't thought about the guy, since high school. But he reached out to me on Facebook, and I just wanted to touch bases. Wanted to know if I remembered him. And of course I remember him. I sent my phone number. He called me. We spent probably 20 or 30 minutes on the phone. And he's a Christian. And I'm a Christian as well, and we talked about our spiritual stories, found out that he came to Christ 2 days after I did at the Billy Graham Crusade in 1976. So that was really neat. And Jim told me the reason that he was reaching out to me is because he is trying to make contact with people in high school that were influential in bringing him to Christ. And I'm not one of those people. I would be the opposite of that, actually. I unfortunately was one of the many who did not treat Jim very well. And that's all in our past. We're friends now, those kinds of things. But Jim told me that of the people that were influential in praying for him, bringing him to the crusade, trying to help him come to know Christ, and that occurred, every person to whom he's reached out is no longer walking with Christ. Every person has wandered. And Jim was just devastated. And so he was greatly encouraged to find out that I was a pastor. And he's been a pastor for a short while, retired military career, Air Force. And just this morning, Jim, I got my book that he wrote. It's called My Journey in Psalms. And he personalizes the Psalms with his own life journey. And so I got it today. Just this morning, and I'm looking forward. So, Jim, thanks for the book. I appreciate that. Here's a point I want to make with this opening story about my friend Jim. Listen carefully. There is no guarantee that because you're walking faithfully with Christ today, that you will do the same tomorrow. There's no guarantee. That's the ideal. That's what we want. But the human heart, there's a tendency in the human heart to wander. It happened in the book of Jeremiah. It happened throughout the scriptures. It happens in our culture and society today, not only in the States, but in other places around the world. The context in which we're looking today, the book of Nehemiah, is that he is in Persia, giving a follow-up report to the king of Persia on how things are going in Jerusalem. And when Nehemiah came back a year later, he found that there were multiple moral failures, multiple spiritual failures, and the question we're asking is why? How did this happen? We've seen from the beginning of this book that Nehemiah was an outstanding leader. We saw in the last several chapters in Nehemiah that the people in Jerusalem are living in a secure city. They're spiritually strong. There's been a revival, so to speak. They have made a full-blown commitment to honoring God and living for Him completely according to the Scriptures. But now all of that has faded away. And I'm asking myself, why did that happen? And remember I said at the very beginning, we're going to look at Nehemiah through the lens of leadership. Now, Nehemiah was a strong leader, but he was not a perfect leader. And as I look back at what happened in this final chapter of Nehemiah, I see reflections of my own leadership and my own mistakes I've made in leadership. And one of the things that Nehemiah failed to do when he left for a year on official business was to make sure that there were solid, trusted men of integrity who could maintain the momentum that had been established under Nehemiah's leadership and authority. That was not in place. There was a leadership vacuum. You've heard the phrase, when the cat's away, the mice will play? Yeah. I told my story to a man who runs a conflict resolution ministry, and I told him my story, and he said, how long after you were either on vacation or on sabbatical were you terminated from your ministry? And I said, 6 weeks. And he says, that's about average. He says, typically a pastor, when he comes back from a vacation or a sabbatical within 6 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks, is fired. 258, just in the Southern Baptist Convention alone, 258 pastors a month are fired. It's sad. It's sad. Regardless, this was a problem in Nehemiah's day. He didn't have the right leadership in place to see that the citizens of Jerusalem would not wander, and they did. They did. Now, there is some accountability there. Nehemiah is accountable for that, but so are the people who sinned and the leaders who failed. So I want to look at 5 dimensions here today. Places to which we are prone to wander. Number 1 is this: we're prone to wander toward worldliness. Nehemiah chapter 13, I'm going to read the first 3 verses. On that day, they read aloud from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people, and they were found written in it that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God, because they did not meet the sons of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. However, our God turned the curse into a blessing. So when they heard the law, they excluded all foreigners from Israel. Here's what's happening. We're not going to go into the detail about the story of Balaam and Balak. We did that recently in a series on my favorite Old Testament stories. You can go back to the Cascadia Church website or the Facebook page here and find that message. But the idea here is that God did not want Israel's purity to be contaminated by foreigners. It seems harsh, and it seems radical for God to tell his people, I don't want you to allow foreigners into your culture without them accommodating your culture. That's the idea. If they're going to become a part of you, they become a part of you. You don't become a part of them. So here's the question then that should have been asked to the people in Jerusalem, because they're compromising in this way. God said, don't do this. And they said, we're going to do it anyway. The question is, at what point do we, listen carefully, at what point do we say it's just too costly to be spiritually pure? That's the question that they didn't answer. At what point does it become too costly to remain spiritually pure? Listen, is it ever right to say this? Hey, look, there are a lot of people out there who disagree with us. A lot of people out there. Let's just bring him in and see how that goes. Let's just bring him in and see what happens. That's what they were doing with their marriages and with their culture. And we're going to see in a little bit what Nehemiah did because of these marriages. Now, I'm not saying that this is a prescription for us today in America, that we can't interact with non-Christians, we cannot marry people from other cultures and so forth. That's not the prescription for us. This is describing a problem in Jerusalem. This is describing a problem among Israel, living under the law. We're not Israel. We're not living under the law. But here's the point. When there is cultural compromise and we allow those who disagree with us to become a part of who we are and to influence now who we are and what we believe and so forth, that only clouds the will of God. It only confuses people today who need Jesus. And once the world starts getting its foot in the church and infecting the church, one of the first things that goes out the window is respect for God and reverence for God. And everything sacred begins to diminish. And things look quite different. Quite different. Which is precisely what happened in Jerusalem. It happens in churches today. They get a little taste of, what it might be like to have the world be a part of the church. I read another article this week about a mega pastor. And they call him the pastor to celebrities. And all these famous people are infatuated with this guy. Well, he's out of the ministry because of moral failure. And that's not the problem. The moral failure is a big problem, but the big problem was his spiritual failure first. In being just captivated and mesmerized by the world. And that became his focus in ministry, and he's out of the ministry, and he should be. He should be. So here's the second one. We're prone to wander toward irreverence. This is what happens when the world begins to influence and infiltrate God's people. See this, verse 4? Now prior to this intermarriage that was forbidden for the people of Israel, Eliashib the priest, that's the high priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, being related to Tobiah. Who is Tobiah? Nehemiah's archenemy. This is bad guy number one. And the high priest is related to him by marriage. Their family. Big problem. Big problem. Eliashib had prepared a large room for Tobiah. Here's what's going on. Spiritual compromise was being displayed by the high priest. The high priest. See this? Nehemiah is writing, prior to this other problem that I just mentioned to you, Eliashib the priest was guilty of compromise spiritually and relationally. He himself was doing what God said you are not allowed to do. Now, I talked about this quite a bit back in December. You can go back to my message called How to Handle Your Critics. And that message is all about leadership, trust, and betrayal. That's what's happening here in this section of Scripture. Now, Eliashib as high priest knew that it was wrong for people to be living in the temple courts. But Eliashib welcomed Tobiah, the enemy of the leader of Israel, and the people of Israel, actually. And he compromised, and it was a display of irreverence for God by allowing this man to live in the temple courts. It was forbidden. But he let it happen anyway. See verse 6? During all this time, I was not in Jerusalem. Nehemiah was in Persia. He was doing official business with the king that funded the building project and gave them permission to build and so forth. And so when Nehemiah was away, Eliashib, listen carefully, did things that he knew that Nehemiah would not tolerate. He knew it. But he thought, I'm autonomous, I'm independent, there's no accountability, I can do whatever I want. And he did. He made a poor choice. So Nehemiah writes this, I came to Jerusalem and learned about do you see this word? It was evil. It was evil that Eliashib, the evil that he had committed for Tobiah, for the enemy. He did it for the enemy. Eliashib chose poorly. He illustrates that the human heart gravitates toward autonomy, independence, in the search for power and control and significance and importance and to be liked by people and so forth. And this is what Eliashib did. And all of Jerusalem followed him. They followed his poor spiritual leadership. And that's the human heart. We're prone to wander toward irreverence toward God because this is what it is. It's irreverence toward God. Number 3, we're prone to wander toward selfishness. Once God's kind of on the sidelines, we become prominent. And now it's all about me. Look at this. I'd also discovered that the portions of the Levites had not been given to them. We talked recently about what spiritual revival looks like, what spiritual health looks like. And one of the things is that the people of God take care of their leaders, spiritual leaders. They make sure that their financial needs, their material needs are met. And this is no longer happening in Jerusalem. You see that? The portions of the Levites had not been given to them. People stopped giving to support the ministry. They're no longer giving because they're spiritually compromised and they're thinking only about themselves. And that comes up here in just a moment quite strongly. You'll see why this was a problem. So what was happening with the spiritual leaders not being cared for in the way that the scripture says they're supposed to be cared for caused Nehemiah to become quite angry. Notice this. I reprimanded the officials, these are the cultural leaders, political and spiritual, in Jerusalem, and said, why has the house of God been neglected? So this word quarrel or reprimanded means to quarrel, it means to contend, it means to argue, it means you raise your voice because you are angry. We find several people, including Jesus, the Apostle Paul, Moses, others, Old and New Testament, who got quite angry because of spiritual compromise. Notice this. Later on in this chapter, verse 17, he uses the same word. I reprimanded the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this evil thing that you are doing by profaning the Sabbath day? Again, he calls it what it is. It's evil. We're going to look at that again in just a moment. Here's another use of the word quarreled. It's the same Hebrew word translated into as quarreled this time. I quarreled with them and cursed them. We're going to look at that again in just a few moments. But what I want you to see is this word that's repeated here for emphasis. Nehemiah comes back from Persia and he sees spiritual and moral compromise and he is hot. He's angry. And I'll tell you this, if you have a spiritual leader who's not angered by sin, you do not have a spiritual leader. God is angered by sin. He doesn't like it. And we shouldn't either. And so a genuine spiritual leader will confront people who have compromised. That's exactly what Nehemiah is doing. He's going to them face to face, verbally saying, you're sinning. You've sinned. You've failed. You've compromised. So Nehemiah was there to make things right. It's his job. That's what he does. And once he discovered the root of the problem, these officials in the city, he reprimanded them because they were responsible and they were failing. And then he replaced them with trusted leaders. We go to verse 14 and we see that. He replaced them and then he prayed about it. That's what I wanted to say. He replaced those with trusted leaders. That comes up again in a moment as well, because there's so many things that are repeated here. But then he prayed about this. There's a series of short little prayers in this final chapter. He says, remember me for this, my God, and do not wipe out my loyal deeds, which I have performed for the house of my God and its services. Nehemiah is not doing this because he wanted power and control and popularity and a paycheck and all those kind of things. He did it because it was the right thing to do. This is about God and his glory. And so he prays this prayer, and it's quite a prayer. Nehemiah acted with pure motives, as pure as they could be. And I don't see anything wrong with saying, God, don't forget the good things that I've done for you. Remember them, God. He promises us a reward for our faithfulness. And so this is not a bad way to pray if you're serving God faithfully. Number 4, here's the fourth thing. We're prone to wander toward materialism. This is why the people stop giving. This is why they stop supporting the household of God. They're more focused on their own house. See verse 15? In those days, I saw in Judah people who were treading wine presses on the Sabbath and bringing in sacks of grain and loading them on donkeys, as well as wine, grapes, figs, and every kind of load. And they were bringing them into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. So with a leadership, a genuine, godly, spiritual leadership vacuum, people living in the city and outside, listen carefully, became more interested in money than in honoring God. If you want to say this, you can say they started skipping church because there's money to be made. That's what they were doing on the Sabbath. They're no longer going to worship. It's no longer a day of rest. Here's an opportunity to make some money, and we're going to cash in. And nobody stopped them. Nobody said, you're breaking the law. You're disobeying the Lord. They were making poor choices. And it caused Nehemiah to rebuke the cultural leaders. Here's those 17 and 18 read. Then I reprimanded the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this evil thing that you're doing? By profaning the Sabbath day. Notice this. You were adding to the wrath against Israel by profaning the Sabbath. It's one of the reasons Israel went into exile to begin with. And they're doing it again. Nehemiah is asking, what are you thinking? This needs to stop. So Nehemiah knew that spiritual compromise was robbing God's people of God's best. And so he ordered the gates closed on the Sabbath. Nobody comes in, nobody goes out. And he said there's no business to be conducted on the Sabbath. It's a day of rest, and that's the way it's going to be. And they turned around. And then, as he did previously, he prayed about it. 22, for this also remember me, my God, and have compassion on me according to the greatness of your mercy. The need for compassion, he's admitting that, look, I'm not a perfect guy, God. I've got my faults, I've got my failures, I've got my promises that I have broken, I've got compromises that I've made, so I am no more guilty than anybody, I'm no more innocent than anybody else, but I'm admitting it to you, God. So help me to help them. All right, number 5, we're prone to wander toward syncretism. Syncretism, that's a big word we don't use often. But what I mean by that is blending, listen carefully, blending spiritual truth with spiritual lies and saying that's okay. Blending spiritual truth with spiritual lies and saying that's okay. That's syncretism or pluralism. Verse 23, in those days I also saw that the Jews had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Now pause for just a moment. Earlier in this series, I showed some maps with Jerusalem, and I also showed Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. This is where the enemy lived. These are enemies of God's people. And in the time that Nehemiah was away, the people in Jerusalem said, they're pretty hot. Let's get it going here. And they're marrying these foreign wives, and God said, you're not allowed to do that. The very people that tried to stop what God was doing, the people in Jerusalem now are marrying those people. Verse 24, as for their children, have spoken the language of Ashdod. These are the Philistines. These are bad dudes. And none of them knew how to speak the language of Judah. None of the kids knew Hebrew. Their culture is being erased. But only the language of his own people. So, the Jerusalemites had allowed the world to infuse their culture in the city there and in surrounding areas. And is beginning to infect who God's people were as God's people. This is the straw that broke Nehemiah's back. He's had it. Enough. And he blows a fuse. I don't know if he sinned or not, but this man is hot. He is hot. Take a look at this. So I quarreled with them and cursed them and struck some of them and pulled out their hair and made them swear by God, you shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor take any of their daughters for your sons or for yourselves. You have committed all this great evil by acting unfaithfully against our God. Those are very strong words. And I've never come to the point where, I've cursed at people and hit them and started pulling out their hair. But Nehemiah did. And I don't see anything where he said, God, I went too far. I don't see where he confesses this. I don't know if he did the right thing or not. I'm just going to say that that's all it says about it. Maybe we can talk about it during Flock Talk a little bit. But he is hot. And then he prayed about it, as he did a couple of other times. Notice this. It's no longer remember me, it's remember them. See the difference there? Remember them, my God, because they have defiled the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. God, they've gone too far. And so he's talking to God about it. Nehemiah knows that he needs to hit the spiritual reset button regarding leadership. He needs to replace and reassign spiritual leaders in Jerusalem, so he does. In verse 30, so I purified them, he's talking about the Levites, from everything foreign. It means that the wives and kids have to go. And assigned duties to the priests and the Levites, each in his work. And I arranged for the delivery of wood at appointed times and for its first fruits. We talked earlier about the need for wood to constantly be brought to the temple area so the fire can be burning perpetually. The priests let the fire go out. Just wasn't that important anymore. There's money to be made. There are people to marry. We're going to do these things instead. Nehemiah is hot. He is really upset. And so he made things right. He essentially fired the priests who were failing and replaced them. And then he prayed about it. Remember me, my God, for good. And that's how the book ends. That's how it ends. Just boom, it's over. Kind of interesting that it seems to be coming together concluding quite abruptly, but that's how the Spirit of God prompted Nehemiah to finish his writing. God, just don't forget what I've done. And I'm doing the best I can to keep things right. And have the right people in the right place to do the right thing at the right time in the right way. That's what leaders do. So it brings us to the end of our series in Nehemiah. It brings us to our final takeaway for this series, which is this: I will not wander. By the grace of God, I will not wander. Autonomy, self-governance, independence are dangerous attitudes, dangerous values. We are not meant to be alone. It's not good that any of us is alone. We need each other. We need relationships. We need accountability. And we have a tendency to wander toward what is forbidden because we're human. We want to be the master of our own destiny. People are being taught that from a very young age. You're the captain of your own ship. You're the master of your own destiny. Take life by the horns and you go where you want to go and don't let anybody stop you. That's not biblically wise. What happens instead is you end up being the master of your own disaster. You created this for yourself because you wandered. And that's a foolish journey, and we're going to encourage you, don't go there. That's why we're here as a church. Not only live, but online and other ways that we connect with each other to help each one of us stay true where we need to be and the direction we need to be going. So it's what we say here often: stay focused and stay faithful. Do that often. All right, that ends the series for Nehemiah. Let me show you where we're going to go next week. Just for a couple of weeks before we get into Easter. And I'm going to do a message on finding clarity in a confused world. Just take a look at what's on the screen. These are things that are in the news. Believe it or not, Mr. Potato Head is in the news. So is Coca-Cola, Disney Plus, Dr. Seuss. Because we'll tell you more in the series. Mascot names for teams at Thomas Jefferson High School, my alma mater. Federal Way School Board wants to change that name to Truth and Justice High School. Because they say the school was named after a slave owner. Well, if that's your focus, I'd always thought it was named after one of the presidents of the United States who had flaws just like me, just like you, just like everybody. This is crazy. And I'm not going to, in this next series, I'm not going to tell you the way that you should think. I'm going to let the Word of God do that for you. I'm going to show you from the Scriptures, does God have anything to say about what we're going through right now in this culture? I've got a verse here, 2 Timothy 3:1. Realize this, that in the last days difficult times will come. Focus, based on this verse, we are not in difficult times. These are not difficult days. They are confusing days. But we'll talk about what difficult days really look like, what they look like in the first century church. And to bring a little perspective on how awful and terrible is this really. God said it's coming. Not only this kind of stuff, but worse. But this is setting the stage for conformity. And we'll talk about that in the next couple of weeks. It's not going to be a long series. I just want to give you some handles and filters, I suppose, so that when you read and you hear this kind of stuff, how do we think about this biblically? And you're not going to find a chapter and a verse about Dr. Seuss. You're not. Or Mr. Potato Head, or whatever. In fact, potatoes aren't even mentioned in the Bible. That's why they were banned in Ireland in the 1800s. Because potatoes aren't mentioned in the Bible, we're not supposed to eat them. That's dumb. But that's what happens when people don't think biblically and clearly about things. So, all right, anyway, I've rambled too much. We're done here. We're done with Nehemiah. We're done with the message today. You know where we're going to go in the next few weeks. So those of us that are here, we're going to sing, and we're going to say goodbye to those that are watching. We appreciate you joining us this morning, so let's say goodbye. Bye. Here we go. Okay, see you next week.